Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Brock Beard from Nascar.info, and welcome to a special bonus episode of Behind the Wall. We were originally going to do our next show this next Sunday. We still will for the events at the Bristol Dirt Track on Saturday and Sunday with the Truck Series and the Cup Series. But obviously, with the many news stories that have broken just today, felt the need to absolutely throw my own hat into the rig here. So thank you again for tuning in tonight. We'll definitely jump right into it. First and foremost, the news from very earlier this morning was that NASCAR held a regularly scheduled meeting with different team owners in the sport, and that the team owners boycotted the meeting, and they did not show up for it. According to the post from Bob Pockrass's page here, indicating that it was about the lack of progress that has happened in the upcoming discussion here about the TV deal and about how, what the distribution is going forward here. Very interesting to see how all this shook out. The post, I want to make sure I get the exact words here from Pockrass's post here. Teams did boycott Team Owners Council meeting scheduled for today. This posted at 8:53 this morning Pacific. This meeting wasn't necessarily to discuss the revenue distribution model, but typically is about initiatives in the sport. The boycott was a message about needing to make progress on revenue distribution talks. This is something that definitely has come up a lot in Denny Hamlin's show, for example. Other discussions about where this is this is heading. I know there's already been discussion about the possibility of a split. There have been, I've seen a couple of videos, people talking about this. Of course, David Land, I think, did a good breakdown of kind of his thoughts of it. I think it's particularly eye-opening from his perspective, being an open wheel fan, and of course the split that IndyCar itself endured back in the 1990s here. This is not to say that this is any guarantee of such an outcome, but it is a sign of, definitely an issue that's going to have to be resolved at some point. And both sides are going to have to figure out exactly what they're willing to give up to keep going forward, if that's going to be the plan. And that's going to be kind of the thing. So really, between all of this, we got, just kind of, probably the best way to do this is just kind of bring up all three stories here right off the bat. There's other subsections of all this. So we got the boycott at the beginning here. Then Adam Stern posted a little later on today that there apparently is an issue with the permanence of the charter system, and that perhaps this is one other sticking point in these ongoing negotiations about the upcoming TV contract and how much money from that the teams are going to be collecting. This posted by Stern this afternoon. Though teams in NASCAR have reached a point of relative satisfaction over a new revenue sharing model, the charter system model remains a sticking point, with NASCAR chairman Jim France said to be dead set against making it permanent. Certainly an eye-opening statement here. I think that probably the thought was, when the charter system was brought in 2016, 2017, that this is going to be the new business model and bring other teams into the sport and just have a complete restructuring of the business model. Still very surprised that NASCAR ceded that much power in deciding to do this, but this is the first real indication we've had of anything outside of that there, and if that's going to be changing. And then the third story on top of this is, of course, the later story about Kaulig Racing. Now, we heard about Hendrick Motorsports and the Louvre penalty, and Kaulig Racing being involved in this at the same time. All four of the Hendrick team slapped with 100-point penalties. And Kaulig Racing also getting a 100-point penalty for apparently adjustments made to the louvers on the cars. The Hendrick penalties were rescinded after they were presented to an appeals board. And then after the Kaulig case was presented to a different appeals board with different members, and it's important to keep that in mind, their penalty was only scaled back a little bit from 100 points to 75 points. And I just received this article from Seth Agert over at Kicking the Tires, the article by Jerry Jordan, and really brings up an important distinction. I think it's important to bring this up right off the top here with this particular issue, is that it comes down to who is presenting the case. That you had a different group of judges that were there, and who was presenting the case and how much experience do they have in trying to present a successful appeal. Hendrick Motorsports has clearly been in this situation more times than Kaulig has, and perhaps that was a factor in this. But at the same time, it's also still worth discussing the transparency of the appeals process. So again, we'll get into all three of these here, just kind of giving an overview, but just kind of want to start with all those and jump into that there. So a lot is happening, and I think you could probably lump all three of these stories into what exactly the future is of the sport here and what needs to be figured out. So let's go right back to the beginning here and talk about this team owner council boycott from this morning. Now, again, the talks have been ongoing here with the upcoming broadcast deal that's going to be coming up after the conclusion of 2024. Speculation about which broadcast partners that are still in this between Fox and NBC, or if we're going to get any new people that are going to be involved in this. And how much money is going to be on the table to begin with. A lot of the discussion that originally already popped up when this first story broke here was about the declining TV ratings. Now, I personally don't look at those a whole lot because it always seems like it's always lower from one year to the next, and I don't obsess too much over that. But I know there's a lot of people that do track it. And even looking at the first part of this season and seeing the difference from one year to the next, I know that there is a concern, and within the context of the new contract, of course, if there's a continuing trend of lower TV ratings, then are these networks going to be putting as much money out there, or is NASCAR going to be able to get as much money from this? That's very much in doubt. I think that's still something to kind of concern ourselves with. And of course, this complicates the issue of teams, and again, Denny Hamlin's been very vocal on this, but he's not been the only voice in this, about the fact that these teams have scaled back as much as they can and operate in operating costs and trying to kind of stay functional, and then at the same time still try to demand more money from NASCAR, or get a deal similar to what the tracks have, or just improve the split on it. It's challenging, and I apologize for being a little scattered on this here, because what I think the issue that I have with a lot of this here is it feels like a lot of the problems that maybe seem like they were just small or trivial issues in the past that have just kind of been left on the sidelines here have now just compounded and now all of a sudden created a situation that probably would have been avoidable if things had been treated differently back then. You have to have anticipated that when the charter system was created, and you have these teams that are now one unified body, that's pretty much most weeks, the entire starting field, not even like a portion of the field, not even like the top teams, like your Penske's and your Gibbs and so forth, but everybody except for the open teams. And then a lot of times, especially recently, in recent weeks, we've had open teams that are just fielded by teams that have charters, Chandler Smith's entry and so forth. When the charter system was created, you just knew that they were going to flex this muscle. And I thought when the RTA, not NASCAR necessarily, it just completely changes about you create this charter asset, which is a legal fiction. It's not a physical thing anybody owns, but you just literally say, okay, this is a charter. It's now it now allows you to stay in business because you're going to be able to market yourself to spotters, because you're going to have a guaranteed starting spot the entire year. Basically commodifying the top 35 rule, but not allowing a system where people can kind of switch in and out of it. Basically, a team would have to collapse and sell their charter for anything to change in that sense. So you have that, and that this market is created with no oversight, where teams can buy or sell or lease these charters, and this is going back and forth, and the cost of those is going up and up. And then, of course, that cost is eating into the actual operating costs of these teams, although some teams are able to pay it off pretty quickly. But it's also stymied the growth of other teams that want to get into the sport, like Junior Motorsports, like other programs there. These aren't new debates. I mean, I'm sure I've bent your guys' ears plenty of times about this. But it's remarkable that we have now this situation where, okay, you have these teams and things are costing more and more, and they can't scale back any more costs for anything else, and they're frustrated with the communication with the sanctioning body, and they're even more frustrated with the way that money is being distributed, versus the expenses that that tracks are able to pick up and that the sanctioning body has, or if they pick up sponsors that are sponsoring NASCAR versus the teams, and then the declining effort of sponsors. Again, a lot of different directions there. So you have all this culminating at the same time as you have declining TV ratings, which, again, I don't obsess too much about, but I do agree are going to be a factor in the discussions of what the new broadcast deal is going to be. And like David Land was saying in his video, yeah, maybe it's going to be less money on the table. And so now you have not only teams not happy with how much money they're getting, from the TV deal that's already ongoing, but now there's potentially going to be less money to be fighting over to begin with. And then, of course, then the extreme example is speculation about, okay, well, are these teams going to unify even more and just take their business elsewhere? Are they going to, try to look at a different sanctioning body, or are they going to create their own, or whatever's going on? And of course, at the same time, you got people investing in short track racing. You got Dale Jr., part of his deal there. And the SRX series on the rise, even though these are, fundamentally different racing series with completely different cars and tracks and so forth, but they're competitors. They're competitors to stock car racing in different ways. And how is that going to look on the other side of this? And then on top of this, I guess he really kind of blends together these the first two stories there. This revelation here from Jim France that he doesn't want the charters to be permanent. That's really kind of set things off just a little bit here. Now, to me personally, the thought of not having the charters be permanent, I got to say, I'm a bit relieved in that sense. But I know a lot of these people that are trying to buy and sell these things, or what their long-term plan is in operating a team. I'm sure they've got some pretty big questions here at the same time. So yeah, I don't know, but it's I got to look at my notes because I'm kind of getting a field here, but there's. Gosh, I mean, where to even unpack this? Really, you have the issue of, okay, so you got teams that want more money. You're gonna have potential. We don't know, of course, of less money on the table. I'm also kind of curious. I mean, again, where the broadcasts themselves or where the networks themselves factor into all of this. If we're talking about declining TV ratings, the leg of that stool that has not been established here, and I'm surprised it hasn't really come up, at least in the discussions I've seen on this so far, is the way the sport is presented and how, again, this was kind of a small issue that has been kind of ongoing and not really given proper treatment. It's like, okay, if sponsorship is harder to come by, maybe it's because the networks aren't showing as many cars in the field as they could, or they're not, or these companies that are sponsoring the teams aren't activating their brands as well as they could with commercials. Or really the issue is with commercials themselves and how the broadcasts haven't kept up with the rise of streaming services and other forms of entertainment, frankly. And understanding the fact that people aren't going to be putting up with commercials anywhere. I mean, you got people, you could get an ad blocker for watching stuff on YouTube, or you can get YouTube Premium, or you can, you have other services or other options there where you can do that, except in broadcast TV. And you have this sudden reversal here where broadcast TV used to be like, okay, that's the big thing. That gets the most attention. This gets, it's the most prestigious one here. Now it's almost like it's the furthest behind in that sense, where the advanced things are what's going on with streaming and and things that are much more conducive to that model. But then the TV aspect of it here, it's like, oh no, we still have to have the commercials to make sure we pay off, get back any money from, the networks that have paid in this much for these licensing rights to actually show the broadcast to begin with. So you got that issue there too. And again, it's so, on the first, so the first emotion that I generally have here of this is just frustration, because it's like, this seems like all that's happened today would have been very much avoidable if they just didn't allow the charter system to be approved to begin with. I'm still wondering what the actual agreement was. And indeed, I think we're going to find out more about this, especially after the later discussion about the concept of these charters being temporary, at least from what Jim France is putting forward here. If that's the situation, then we really need to understand it, because it sounds like it's even, there was just a quote I saw on Twitter right before coming here about 2311 saying, okay, well, look, what's the point of this being an asset when it could be taken away? Now, I have thoughts on that too, because of course, as we all know from following the back of the grid, a charter can be taken away. And we saw this with Starcom Racing. We've seen this with other teams that have shut down and collapsed since 2016. A lot of teams had to, give their lives basically for the system to be what it is now. And I do think that it is fascinating that, this many decades after a time where you had owner drivers trying to negotiate plan money from NASCAR because they needed some more money to operate their teams because they were really on the fringes and just about to close down. And ultimately they really did, because we don't really have them in the Cup Series now. Even Live Fast Motorsports is still co-owned with B.J. McLeod and Matt Tifft. You have that aspect of it there. But it used to be that there was the small teams that were griping about not having enough money and not getting a fair share of the purse and wanting to renegotiate. And now it's the big teams that are doing it. And when they benefited from getting this, I think in many cases for the big teams out there, your Hendricks, your Gibbs, Penske, and so forth, it was a windfall when they got these charters. Because ultimately, are these teams going to close down? Probably not. Not anymore. I don't think it's any more likely that any of those teams shut down than it had been in 2016 or 2017. So you create a situation here where these these charters are out there, and Hendrick has 4 charters right off the bat, and their teams are locked into all 36 races of the year. It's like, okay, well, they're not going to miss any races. It's like, well, were they ever in any danger of missing a race? Especially when you have 36 cars for 36 spots under the thing now, where you reduce the field down and you basically just have the 36 guys out there and maybe 4 open spots that just go unused. Those are just unused spots. There's any number of weeks that could have had, those teams out there if it was even financially feasible for it. But now these teams that have, they've received this windfall at the cost of other teams that weren't afforded it, which was ultimately by arbitrary requirements, that it was just, we want to reward teams that have been involved in the sport a long time. But their way of defining that was, okay, well, you got to be full-time for like X number of years. But that excluded the Wood Brothers, which have been around for almost longer than NASCAR itself, and ultimately had to get a charter elsewhere by the point where, they've already been pretty much absorbed into Penske. It's been a flawed program from the beginning. And it's also been a situation where, NASCAR has ceded a lot of power that they could have had. You had to have known. You had to have known that when you were going to create this charter and you're going to have rising and falling periods of economic stability in the sport. You're going to have rising and falling periods of interest in the sport. That's not going to change. You can't legislate that away. You think back to 2001, where you had 45 teams that were fully funded, so that you had 43 car fields, and you knew 2 of those fully funded cars were going to not qualify for the race. And you also knew, because the sport was popular, you had a bunch of smaller organizations that were part-time teams that would also make it challenging. So if you were even the lower part of the points, you possibly would miss a race. And then just 3 years later, in 2004, you had 37, 38 full-time teams, and now you got like 4, maybe 5 open spots in the field that you can't even fill. And that hasn't changed. We've still had that between 2016 and now. Maybe things were a bit leaner when this thing started, and you still had some teams that were starting park teams, although really all those starting park teams were running full races by that point, to where you have it now, where you have these celebrity owners, and now they've bought and started teams. You got Trackhouse, you got 2311, you got these other programs, and then they want to expand. They want to run 2 or 3 cars. And then you got other teams like Junior Motorsports that want to try to get into the Cup Series. You got other investors from around the world. I mean, teams like the Three Friends Racing trying to get into the sport and seeing if they can kind of figure things out. That's been pushed back. We haven't seen them make their debut yet. Because we know, just like I'm sure they discovered, just like the rest of us have seen here, that you have a hard cap on the number of charters. So when things are really good or things are really bad, it's just going to stay right at that same level, and it's not going to improve growth in the sport. And honestly, it's too inflexible of a system. And maybe NASCAR knew this when they brought this in there. Maybe this is where the temporary concept was in there. Maybe if their thought was, if not the charter system itself, maybe it was, trying to tweak the system a little bit. Maybe their thought of it is like, maybe it's temporary in its current form. We just don't know, because we don't have the full concept of the agreement there between, really, NASCAR and the RTA. That's really the parties we got to look at here. So I hope more of that comes to pass, because we really need to understand that to dig into this. And that's another reason I want to kind of jump into this here today, and then we can kind of discuss this more if we get some more information throughout the week, because this still feels like a pretty evolving situation. I usually don't like jumping on the stream for something that's still not entirely settled, but there's just too much out there today to say nothing. And it's just going to be in the back of my mind and keep me up all night. So I figure that's where it's probably best to go into this. So I want to talk about, going back to the broadcasts and the aspect with the broadcast in the sport here, and the way that it's portrayed, NASCAR, and again, missing replays of certain wrecks, not showing it off as a sport, not showing as many of the cars in the field, not featuring the sponsors as prominently, and not having an engaging play-by-play. I mean, we've seen a clip earlier today about them looking at doing AI play-by-play in golf. I mean, that's just that tells me that maybe it's an even larger problem than, the NASCAR itself, just the art itself of play-by-play commentary. I mean, all that has an effect on viewership. I really think that, if when NASCAR gets into its next TV contract, one thing they're going to have to keep in mind is that it's no longer just competing against other sports. You are competing against other forms of entertainment. And again, like I said earlier, a lot of these forms of entertainment, people don't put up with commercials. People don't put up with traditional forms of advertising. I mean, how many of you, when you watch a YouTube video, and it has one of ads, they have an ad that's paid for in the middle of it. I mean, there's some channels that do it really well, but there's most channels where it's just irritating. I mean, I skip through them. I'll admit it. People are really, really canny to traditional forms of advertising. And I think, if anything, you would think that the sponsors that want to kind of get their, if the networks want to try to make money back that way, you think they would work something out with the sponsors of the teams themselves, or just kind of, it seems like the frustration over having too many commercials in the broadcast or breaking up the flow of racing versus not having enough sponsorship dollars for the teams. It seems like there's a middle ground there, doesn't it? Maybe it's just from two opposite parties. So maybe that's the issue, but that's kind of the frustrating part to me, because I feel like the quality of the broadcast is definitely a reason for any, if there is going to be less money on the table from these networks, or if it's going to be that much more difficult negotiating this next TV contract. That's kind of the way I'm looking at it with that. The other thing that I think goes back to the charter system and the Cup Series in general. And, again, not to, I'm of two minds on what's going on with the ownership and the owners walking out of, or just protesting this meeting today and wanting to be taken more seriously with negotiations about, getting a bigger piece of the pie. They are the show. And ultimately, with the chartered system, it is, really the entire field. We're not even talking about a portion of it. There's not another faction that's in there. The issue, though, I think about is what are kind of the intangible effects of what the charter system has created here these last few years. One thing I was thinking back to was, covering a lot of these races trackside and going through the garage area. It used to be, the Cup Series garage is like, where you want to be. Like, that's where all the big teams are. That's where all, they get the most attention, the most money. You got the drivers. You got a good mix of like the big teams and the small teams. And there's always been that gap where you have the top teams and the slower teams. You knew generally there was just one portion of the field that was really going to be competing for the win. But everybody kind of had an open space for it. I think when this charter system was proposed, when it was adopted, there was this unrealistic expectation of somehow turning NASCAR into Formula One, and I think that was set right from the beginning, where they made it so much more difficult. First of all, this paranoia over starting park teams to begin with, where really, they're not taking money away from Hendrick or Gibbs or Penske or any of that. What possible threat do they serve? But it's like, oh, no, they don't need to be there. And then, okay, now you got open teams or teams that don't run the full season, and then suddenly they're kind of on the outside. It's like, well, wait a minute, what are part-time teams? What's the danger of them? Why are you making it so much harder for part-time teams to be in the sport? So it's like, no. The only thing that matters is these 36 teams. And then really, it's like, well, not these 36 teams. We know that, it's like, if there's some of these teams where it's like, hey, you have this charter, you have this asset. It's like, do they really want to be in the sport? Or do they just want to just cash that out and probably just, and then just, okay, you don't need to be in there. And then we saw from the Starcom Racing example that it's not always really up to the teams whether or not they sell the charter, which is strange because the charter system was put forward to say, oh, well, we want to make sure all these teams stay in the sport. We don't want a situation where, like in the 90s, Bud Moore Engineering closed or Petty Enterprises doesn't build cars in level cross. But obviously, you got new investors in the team because, again, those rising and, dropping fortunes, things were going to be on the upswing eventually. And we saw that more in 2020, really after, 2020, 2021. Obviously, what happened in 2020 had a negative effect on that, and you can't dismiss that. But certainly, bringing in these celebrity owners and these new investors to really be a part of the sport, that's definitely more of a high water mark, and we're seeing more of that interest there. So there's been this complete reshaping of the sport, and I think the charter system was a guise of, I think it feels as an outsider as a bit of a deception, because it was proposed to be a way to increase stability in the sport, make teams be able to bring in sponsors more easily, be able to activate sponsors at the track more easily. But we've still seen teams shut down. We've still seen people cash out. And yes, they're cashing out much more than they would have ordinarily. I'm sure, and that's certainly been one positive, but it almost seems like that's an accidental effect of it, because the market, again, for these charters is so unregulated. And so now at the end of this, you almost do have Formula One, only with cars that are entirely too much on the same level. And Denny Hamlin talks about this on his podcast constantly. You have cars that just can't get away from each other. And that, now, okay, you have a larger part of the field that wins, which sounds exciting on the top of it. But of course, now it makes it harder to pass. You got drivers that are more aggressive. They're not going to let somebody by for a spot. They're going to actually race each other for the spot. And they're going to race too aggressively and they're going to crash. And now we got this whole debate about drivers that are running too aggressively and fighting each other for it. So you had this entire progression that has gone hand in hand to kind of create where NASCAR is. And it's like, on the surface, it's like, oh, well, now we got these teams and these teams will be around and they're just always going to be there. Always going to have 2311 and these other ones. There's probably, I'm sure there's a couple of teams that those who are big proponents of the charter system would rather not have charters. And they're just kind of waiting for them to kind of get out. And then so somebody else can, so this team can have a fifth, a fourth car, or this team can have a third car, or whatever the situation may be. And then, you're going to have, that's really the only difference is the level of parity that you have in the sport versus Formula One. And it just becomes more elite. And while, elite has a positive connotation, and you can say, well, okay, it is the Cup Series. It's the top division. It should be the hardest to get into it. It should be the hardest. You should have the most challenging competitors that you race against. It should be the most intense racing, the longest schedule. It should have all that. Well, in theory. But the other thing is, I gotta say, like when I was at Sears Point last year, I didn't find the Cup Garage nearly as interesting. I was much happier in the Xfinity or in the Truck Garage last year, and I'm excited about the Xfinity Series this year. And I'm kind of seeing this massive barrier that's now between the Cup Series and Xfinity and trucks, where you have a very competitive package in Xfinity and trucks. You still have a lot of underdogs, a lot of different teams that switch drivers frequently. It's kind of like a time capsule to the way the Cup Series used to be years ago, which part of that is intentional because some of the teams that were squeezed out of the Cup Series or some of the drivers that did end up going back down into Xfinity or trucks. And some with more success than others. But it almost is at the cost of the Cup Series. Like it's like some part of its soul is missing a little bit. Again, at Sears Point last year, I spent very little time in the Cup Garage, and I didn't really notice it until after the weekend was over with. And I was like, wow, I didn't really I was there certainly during the race itself and tracking when somebody fell out of the race. But I didn't feel as much gravity towards, kind of checking out what was happening there. That's not to say to ignore it at all, but, it's just not the same. And I do think that that's part of the culture that the charter system has created, because you have this extra layer of what's going on behind the scenes. And it does. And so that's, and again, I'm not sure how many other people are feeling this, and certainly chime in if you've sensed this yourselves or anything like that. It's kind of hard to tell from the broadcast sometimes, but it's just something's just a little bit off. It's just a little bit off, and I don't know what it is. But I sensed it again today with these announcements and the discussion of a possible split, which I think is still, I don't think it's a major concern, but it should be in the back of people's mind when the negotiations keep coming up, because we just don't know. We don't know what NASCAR would be without the big teams that are in there, or if say it was all the chartered teams, and then who would? I mean, I must have rewritten my tweet about this 4 or 5 times earlier today because I wasn't sure. It's like, one of my thoughts was like, well, we're going to need a whole lot more field fillers if it's going to be the entire field. And then I was like, well, okay, maybe not that, but I mean, something of that nature. But I kind of chewed on it and, really, and again, I don't know, how much of this is out there. But it's, if you got the top teams in the sport, and they're demanding money and they're demanding this, and they're demanding that, and they want to do this, they want to do that, and you got and Hendrick, Penske and Gibbs, say like just a few teams that maybe represent like a half of the sport. If they want to break off, they want to do that. I'm I'm so frustrated with the way this system has, again, given these big teams a windfall that they're never going to use, but at the same time, have and then create this whole thing where they've squeezed out these small teams. It's like I start thinking, it's like, well, like if you had the Cup Series and maybe you just brought all the Xfinity guys up there, what would that look like? What would that be the situation? And how successful would, the Cup teams be if they were in something completely separate from NASCAR? I don't know. Is this a situation where the ambitions of the sport's top teams have become so large and just so out of control that, maybe they need to realize, how dependent they are on the sport, and maybe they need to compromise a bit more. I know that may seem ludicrous because, again, I'm not a part of a team or anything like that. But I always criticize one of the reasons I usually criticize the broadcast so much is I feel that there's a lot of waste there. I think there's a lot of potential. I think there's a lot they could be doing. But there's just a lot that's just wasted on things that if they just took the money that's being wasted on segments that people don't like, and kind of trim things down a little bit, they'd have more money for other things. I'm wondering how much of that is true for these Cup teams. When again, they have guaranteed money. They have guaranteed money. They have guaranteed starting spots, which means that they should be able to get any sponsor they want, from any of these teams. And they're not able to. Now, of course, yes, the other part you can't leave out of this, of course, is that, we're in a recession. It's no mystery, it's definitely happening. You got inflation, you got all that. But these companies, it's not like these companies aren't disappearing. These companies are still there. They're going to try to do something that's going to be a return on the investment. So that's kind of the issue. So that's the thing that frustrates me is I'm starting to think like, okay, well, it's like, look, if the Cup teams are going to be this intractable with this, what's going to be the net effect of this? I mean, is it going to be a situation like the IRL versus cards? Is it going to be something like that? If NASCAR teams went on and started their own program, would it be a superior product to what NASCAR puts out there? I'm not sure. First of all, what are they going to drive? Because NASCAR has a spec car that they've now created that everybody has to have. And I think that's been part of the burden that a lot of these teams have had because they've had to completely replenish their fleets of cars. And that's been a big issue. So that's kind of the issue. But on the other hand, I mean, if there is a series that does have a better potential of bringing in grassroots drivers into the sport, or an opportunity for grassroots drivers to get into the sport. I mean, think about 1969 and the strike that happened at Talladega. And as much as that was a taxing experience for everyone, that was Richard Childress's first Cup start. I mean, he wouldn't have even been in the Cup Series. May not have even had the opportunity. Maybe he would have, but maybe he wouldn't have if it weren't for that time in 1969. For every conflict, there is a potential of maybe, it kind of changing course and maybe kind of, helping somebody out that wouldn't have received help ordinarily. The difficulty here is certainly the fact that the charter system, if you just had all the charter teams just pack up and go out, that's the whole field. And NASCAR's just not going to be left with anything. So I think NASCAR should tread very carefully, in their debates. I don't think they're in a position to say, to be in the position that maybe older members of the France family were, where it's like, look, this sport's more than just one person. We're always gonna be around. We'll have another driver that's gonna come around. They'll be a big name, and then they'll be the next face of the sport. And if it's not gonna be these guys, it's gonna be somebody else. I'm not sure if they're in that position they can do that. So on top of that, I mean, talk about something that's gonna be a challenge for people that are new to the sport, or people that don't understand the sport very well. They're gonna be completely at a loss. You definitely check out NASCAR Man's video on the split. that he did there, where you kind of really see the conflict of even the point of just having a race run on the same day as the Indy 500 that has Indy cars in it, but it's not the IndyCar series, or it's not the IRL. It could be a real big mess. So they need to work it out. They need to work it out. As tempted as I am to say, well, hey, screw them. Okay, we don't need these teams. We kind of do. We kind of do. I mean, look at the effect. I'm sure, there's plenty of Chase Elliott fans can attest to this, how frustrating it is to not have him out there. We'll probably are going to see some effect. The effect in the ratings once he comes back will be interesting. Although some of the races he was in were still down on ratings this year either. So, maybe it's bigger than one person, but a whole group of drivers, I don't know. It's gonna take some effort, and I'm tempted to just stay in the past and just berate NASCAR for giving up this much power to begin with, because this should have been entirely foreseeable. That you're going to create this, you are creating a faction within the sport, or just allowing it to happen, and that the first thing the RTA did was completely restructure the way that these races are run, really, all the way down to way qualifying is determined with these teams. I just think that's extraordinary, but I can't help but think that there weren't some strings attached in that process. So we got to find out what the parameters are of these charters. This latest thing here from Jim France and about the charters being a temporary solution, temporary to what? I mean, I don't see them going back to the other. I mean, Tommy Joe Martins was very vocal on this on Twitter too. I mean, you're not going to be able to just take a charter and then say it goes from $20 million to just nothing. But again, is this an expansion of NASCAR's ability to rescind charters, to take them away from a team? Because they could definitely do that. There's definitely some power that NASCAR still has in the charter system. We know it from at least that example. But does that include, completely invalidating the system, or does it include making tweaks to the system, that still keep it out there? I don't know. I don't know. I think that's going to be really interesting, but they're going to have to figure it out. And the problem is that the circumstances are going to, I mean, as valid as if the team's concerns are valid, it's the timing is still just terrible. Because if you have declining ratings and you have networks that are probably going to put less on the table, and you got teams that want to make more money that can't scale back more than they can, and then they got this new car that's already been in the sport for just over a year, and they're constantly making changes to it because there are issues with it. It just kind of reaches a critical mass. And I don't know what the proper solution is. I guess the one positive you can look at it is that if misery needs company, maybe it's a situation where both sides just really need to kind of, come together and just be like, look, I mean, it's pretty, we may not have a perfect agreement in place, but separate, we're both really going to be struggling here. Do the teams really want to take on the hassle of creating a sanctioning body? I mean, what, are they going to go back to the Streamline Hotel and start something up between themselves? I'm not so sure about that. And the sanctioning body, are they going to want to lose, all the drivers they have in the circuit when it's the entire field? No, I don't think so. So maybe there's some room for, maybe a bit more room for negotiation there. But there's going to have to be some transparency, and we're going to have to figure out, what on earth is going on here. I'm just wondering how much more about the charter system we don't know. And again, I say we, I mean, I make sure it's not just me. This is one of those situations that makes me wonder how much of it is just me. But I'm sensing from the discussions today that people are having kind of similar reactions to all of this. So I guess it's not, but yeah, I feel like I've just been rambling, and I'm sure I have, but it sounded more concise in my mind. But that's kind of the big part of the issue I have with this. So, I don't know. I'm still at that point there where I just want to just point at, this trend that we've been on here and say, see, we could, if we changed this and we didn't do that, we wouldn't be here, but now we're here. And that's the part where I don't really have any firm answers about where we do go from here. Part of me does want to say, like, look, if is this a situation where, the big teams feel like, they're better than this and they need to break off and they need to do their own thing and they're tired of dealing with NASCAR, and they think they can do better. I don't know, but or is this a situation where NASCAR is being too intractable and they're just absolutely not being in a situation, is this where the NASCAR is just like saying, look, no, we need that money for this. We need that money for doing the Clash at the Coliseum. We need that money for venturing out and doing these initiatives. I think both, probably the best way to do this would be just to have an actual audit between the teams and NASCAR themselves and trying to kind of really figure out, is there any waste? Is there something that one or the other is doing that is costing a lot of money that doesn't need to be done? And is there a way to kind of bring that, full circle? I think the burden probably is more on NASCAR in that sense than the actual teams. Because the teams are they seem like they're always playing catch up with NASCAR on this spec car and trying to make sure it fits the templates and make sure they're following the rules and everything. So, maybe at the end that'll kind of clear things up. But I don't know how exactly who would go about that or what third party you'd need. Because I think everybody's interest just runs so deep that, I'm not sure how exactly that's going to work out. And this really kind of brings up, goes back into the, the latest story today on the Justin Haley thing. And again, big thanks to Seth Eggert and Jerry Jordan there for sharing Jordan's article there on that. And I guess I'll post that in the description here as well. I think, the infighting between teams and the temptation is there to certainly look at the Hendrick appeal and the Kaulig one. And I guess I really pretty much already discussed this enough already earlier in this. I feel like I kind of went into that a bit more. But you're going to have Hendrick Motorsports and the number of different appeals that they've had over the years. And not to say the Kaulig hasn't been, they've had situations before where they've had cars caught up in inspection. I remember, teams that have had to drop to the back of the field and everything. I think this is maybe the first time they've actually appealed something before. I mean, they've had disqualifications before too. Seems like, they have just as many issues in tech inspection as any other team out there. But again, putting on a case, and putting it out there, I think they did, that's definitely something that could be a factor in there. But it would be nice to understand what those differences were. I mean, without seeing the cases side by side, without having court TV or the equivalent of it there, being able to see the case that Hendrick put on, and then to their appeals panel, it's like, oh, well, they got a good point. Maybe they shouldn't have been penalized, not only 100 points, they shouldn't have been penalized anything. They must have had a heck of a defense that was cobbled together there to put that together. And then with the Kaulig's team, I mean, whether they just didn't have the same argument or they didn't have a very good argument, I'm not sure if it was the facts of the case that were different in that. And I think I could definitely understand the frustration there. That I think in both cases, it was something that was done to the louvers. Was it just a simple case that they couldn't close their hood, just like the Hendrick cars couldn't close their hood? I mean, I guess, there could be a number of different surfaces on a louver. Maybe you do different things to get it fit in there. I mean, was something different? Again, we just don't know. But that's where, we do need more transparency there. And I agree with the consensus on that needs to be figured out, because it does give off a sense of impropriety, where, one appeals panel can come up with a completely different ruling from another appeals panel on what seems to be, at least from what we see, substantially the same infraction, where NASCAR had put forward that, look, you don't mess with the parts. You don't mess with the parts. And that seems to be the rule. And the appeals panel, again, which is not NASCAR, because NASCAR wants to keep those penalties on there because that was their ruling. They have no interest in scaling back any of these penalties. And we saw this with Denny Hamlin and Kyle Busch at Pocono last year. And we saw this with at least what was starting out here with this penalty here. They wanted to be just as firm as ever. It's like, don't mess with these parts. These are spec parts. and you don't do that. Frankly, I don't see the wiggle room between, one case or the other. But again, it was a different panel. Maybe they weren't aware of the facts as the other panel had, or just not aware of the story within the greater context of the Hendrick penalty, because they're just going to talk about the Kaulig one here. And yeah, I mean, it was, but and again, I appreciate the article on this too, because maybe it is a situation where, yeah, one group put on that much better of a case. But that's a big difference. I mean, that's a massive difference. I mean, if you had one where it's like, well, okay, maybe we'll take 25 points off it. But the other one where it's 4 cars and you're going to knock out all of them. I mean, they must have had like, a super lawyer in there for that one to put forward that case. Which I guess is possible. I mean, again, I can't help but think back to my own jury duty from a couple weeks ago. And, it ended up going into like the next day for what seemed to be a pretty straightforward. It was, kind of an assault and battery kind of case there. But there were a couple of factors we had to look at there. And it really, whether, you break something down to like one really small element of one law or one exception, and it could completely flip the case. And we could have come out just as easily, really. I mean, pretty much. We could have come out very easily on like one side versus the other based on like one small distinction or one word in one law. I mean, that's how quickly things can flip around there. And I think that applies to trial advocacy and really to appeals processes there too. It's unfortunate, but yeah, allegedly, exactly, Austin Foster. Yeah, allegedly. It's like, what was going on here? Was it, allegedly we hear it was some kind of change with the surface of the louvers, allegedly about closing the hood or not. I don't know. But again, it's just like a regular perception. Like if you have a whole group of people that all see one thing happen, and then you interview all those people about what they saw, they're not going to say exactly the same thing. And that could be something really mundane. If it's something that's, actually like, a technical infraction or something even more serious, you're still going to have different perspectives. So it's a worthy point. Again, I'm going to post the article in the chat here, because I think it's a good thing to review here. I got to open the other window here and post that in. So yeah. So again, I very much free form here on the show. I don't like doing like a lot of free form shows. I'm worried about saying something really stupid or just going off on a tangent that doesn't really apply it or anything on here. But for this one here, there's just this whole issue here with, what happened and what may happen and what we still need to figure out. I mean, all these things just feel so interconnected to a lot of things that myself and others talk about on this show or shows like this, that probably should have been anticipated a lot better. And it needs to be figured out. So, anyway, let's see. Nicholas Gray, thank you for the super chat here mentioned earlier. The new car in theory was to attract new manufacturers, and the same with the number of sponsors, but nothing new is being brought in the sport. Okay, very good point. Yeah, again, the spec car, much like the charters or anything else, maybe have a stated purpose that was intended to do something very different. And, do the circumstances exist to allow for that? I mean, I don't know. It would be great to see other manufacturers in the sport, just like it's great to see other teams in the sport. But are there other restrictions that are in place that is preventing that from happening? Or is it, can you simply just say, oh, it's the economy? Oh, it's all that. I don't know. It's a good point though. It's a good point because again, I think there's a lot that's at play in the controversies we saw today that have either been just unresolved or maybe were intended to be a temporary fix. Now NASCAR has a history of kind of keeping temporary fixes in place for quite a long time. I think Kyle Petty was the one that talked about the restrictor plate being a temporary fix for the big crashes that happened in the late 80s. And look, I mean, we have tapered spacers now that are standard. I mean, it's become a part of it there. And it's very possible the charter system could end up that direction. I still believe that if the charters do have to exist, and I still don't think they should, but if the argument is put forward that they have to be there and that it can't change one bit, then at least I think it should be used as a way to kind of keep Cup Series regulars out of Xfinity and Truck Series races and make it easier for new talent to come up and attempt some Cup races in anticipation of the rookie seasons. I think that would be something to look at. I'm not going to go too much further down that road because that's a whole other discussion that I've done too many times on this show. But that would be another thing to really think to look at too. Let me browse through some of these comments here at the same time and see if there's anything else to kind of bring up on that. I think that's more or less. I feel like that's more or less what I have to say on the subject here so far. But let me see here. Let's see here. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, Buckshot Jones. What track would the teams race at if they split with NASCAR owns all but 2 tracks on the schedule? Well, yeah, I mean, see, again, there's relevant discussions to be brought up from all this. Again, I don't like going too far down the road on the discussion of the split. I don't want to make it sound like, a split's going to happen. It's absolutely going to happen. No, we don't know that. I think this is still very early in the game. I do think it's something that needs to be kept in mind. And I think people are wise to look at the example that we've seen from open wheel racing and what effect it had, and really how that went hand in hand with NASCAR's rise. That, it used to be that, I still think the Indy 500 is a very special event. I still think it's the greatest spectacle in racing. I have a hard time comparing an event with that much history and that much consistent spectacle to even what NASCAR puts out there, including NASCAR races at Indianapolis. But it's undeniable that the split that happened in open wheel racing coincided with some of the biggest and most successful years for NASCAR, when that gap was already closing before that, going through the 1990s, and that it had a role in that happening. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm advocating a split, because I'm absolutely not. I think that would be disastrous for the sport. And I think it should be a positive, a negative motivator to really kind of get both sides to the table again here and figure things out. And it's going to take one side or the other to kind of loosen up a little bit. But again, I want to know, I really, really do want to know, what are the other strings that are attached for the charter system that NASCAR still has in their back pocket? Because the way this was brought up from Jim France, from what was revealed today, that these are revocable. It's like, okay, well, hang on. It seems like everybody should have known that. Certainly anybody that was selling them, and I mean that has an undeniable effect on the market for them. And yeah, what are things that are happening? What are just power plays that move negotiations one way or the other? I don't know, but things like lockouts or splits or anything like that, they never come out positive for the sport. They just haven't. I'd like to put a smiley face on the potential of that, but the track record just doesn't seem to be there. But that's not to say that the way things are the only way that the sport should be, or the way the teams operate, the way the charter system operates, the way the NASCAR sanctioning body responds to concerns that drivers and teams have. It's not to say that that's the best that it could possibly do. Obviously, things need to be worked out. There's always going to be friction. And that's going to be much more intense when there's money on the table and everybody's watching everybody else for whose hand is going to be reaching into the pile first. I don't know. I think probably the best thing that can happen is just a return to the fundamentals. I think everybody just kind of takes a critical look at what is necessary and what is not. Whether it's an initiative that NASCAR does that maybe isn't getting that much of a return on it, whether it's a team and what resources they're using and they're not getting a return on that, or again, the broadcasts and what where what their strategy in putting together a race, actually showing a race on TV, what isn't furthering the goal of informing the public and perpetuating storylines. I think that's what's going to need to happen, and it's very hard to suggest that because at the same time, time's still moving forward. Races are still being run. We're just barely at the beginning of the year, and who knows what other on-track controversies are going to happen at the same time. It'd be great if, you could set something aside and just have it in a bubble, and then it's not going to be affected by things around it. But that's, of course, not the way the world works. These other factors are always going to be at play. So maybe just a bit of empathy between all the parties, I think, could be understood, and understanding what they could do better. And I think, really, probably a good way to kind of close this diatribe out here is really go back to thinking, what made Fox and NBC pay so much for NASCAR in 2001? Why was that the case? And was it just the economy? Was it just a really good economy and you got, there's just a lot of money and people just overpaid for everything? I don't think so. I think they saw a sport and how it was portrayed on TV, first of all, so you got the broadcast angle of it. You saw teams that were competitive, and you had no ceiling on how many teams you could have, so you didn't have the charter system. You had a situation where you had a lot of new teams that could just start up and operate, and of course, you could start a team and you weren't immediately guaranteed success, but you could work your way up the ranks. You had new drivers, you had old drivers, you had people that were good at certain tracks, you had people that weren't good at other tracks, and again, these were storylines that were covered there. And you had firm leadership from NASCAR, where okay, if something needed to change, or if there was a controversy that was brought up or something like that, there would be somebody say, okay, we're doing this, and we're not doing that. We're doing this. We're gonna do this, and we're gonna make sure. And at the same time, a sanctioning body that would keep an eye out for things that would happen. If you had a small team out there that needed some help. There were reports of, again, NASCAR working with plan money back then. Now, there were flaws to this, too. I don't want to go too far down this primrose path either, because, yeah, of course, at that same time when Fox took over, there were very clearly things that NASCAR wasn't keeping an eye on as to safety and so forth. And they paid dearly for that, and we're still feeling the effects of that even today. But again, is this, there's all these aspects were in, at play, and were why the sport was worth as much as it is. So again, I don't, when NASCAR comes out and says like, oh, we want to reach a mutual benefit of everybody involved, and it's going to improve the stakes of all the stakeholders, and we believe in that. It's like, I hope they're being genuine when they're saying that, because if that's just lip service to just kind of keep things the same, or to discredit the threat of, teams walking out or a lockout or something like that, that is a very dangerous look at it. And I hope that that's not what's happening. I hope they're being genuine when it comes to that, because there's too much at stake. And I don't say that just as, being somebody that's, followed this sport. You want to see the sport thrive. You want to see it be successful. I mean, I don't like doing the whole doom and gloom thing on here. So that's really kind of my look at it there. So, yeah, I think that's about all I have to say on that. So, I'm going to watch this back. Hopefully I didn't say anything too stupid on this. I don't know how clear I've been on this. And I don't feel like I probably shouldn't go too much further down this, because I'm probably going to end up starting to repeat myself if I haven't already. So that'll do it for the show here tonight, folks. We'll do trivia, for our show on, Sunday here. Our next show is going to be after the Bristol Dirt Race on Easter evening. We'll talk about the action for the Truck Series and the Cup Series. Entry list storylines coming up tomorrow, as well as another video on this channel. I got a produced video that's coming up on another controversy that's been going on. And I've been trying to find a good time to post it. I think tomorrow morning will probably be a good time for that. So definitely hit that bell icon if you haven't already, and you'll have access to that as well. So thank you again for tuning in for a special episode here Behind the Wall. I hope you enjoyed my ramblings on all this, and we'll see if there's any more developments on this story through the weekend, and we'll definitely discuss that on Sunday. So thank you again for tuning in, everyone. Have a good evening.